Hello everyone, I'm Marty Pospischil.
And I'm Adam Pospischil.
And we're the Pospischil Property Guys, and welcome to our 10th episode.
Time flies, here we are, episode 10.
How does that happen? That means we've done 9 already.
We have.
I figured that out very quickly.
Math's getting better every day.
Absolutely. And today we're going to talk about these things that many of you are getting in the mail, the BC assessment. And we're here to give you some additional information on that and share some links, et cetera, for you to better understand what you're getting in the mail.
Absolutely. Probably the most common question we get in January.
Absolutely. Very, very common question. So it's understanding your BC assessment is what we're calling this particular fireside chat. Let's jump right into it.
So BC Assessment itself, as you may know, is a Crown corporation here in British Columbia, and basically they provide property assessments, as the name would suggest, for all types of property across the province, and that's primarily for tax purposes. So kind of a couple interesting facts on that, and this is actually some interesting provincial facts on real property in general, but they did 2.16 million property assessments for 2023, so for the year just completed, which just got released basically, and that's up 1% from 2022.
Boy, it's a lot of properties.
Yeah.
That's a lot of properties we're doing here in BC, and the value of all of those came out to $2.72 trillion. That's a lot of money, and that's up 12% from last year.
That's kind of interesting, those numbers, I thought. So, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Interesting stats. And total new construction, $33.52 billion in BC.
Yeah, that's one I'm not so surprised to see with all the cranes around the city.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what about my assessment? Based on the property condition, there's kind of two dates with this whole BC assessment thing. There's October of the previous year, and then there's the July 1st of the year the assessment is issued.
Correct.
Okay, let's talk about those two dates.
Yeah, exactly. So this is probably one of the most common misconceptions when we talk about a BC assessment, because you're typically receiving it in January, but that will be based on the value as of July of the previous year. And for that value of July of the previous year, they're actually taking the property condition from October of the year prior to that. So for example, if you've done a renovation in your home and you got a bunch of permits and the city reports to BC Assessment, here's some improvement to this value of this property, say you added a level to a bungalow, city says that's worth $700,000, et cetera, et cetera. So then when that sort of rolls forward, you can see that they're kind of freezing at a moment in time. They need sort of a cutoff to
For sure.
take a condition of the property.
Yeah, very good. And then they take that condition of the property, they do their computer algorithm for the most part, some are done manually, and the computer algorithm takes all of the comparable sales from the previous number of months, and on July 1st, they have the valuation date.
Exactly.
Yeah. And as we mentioned, most of them are computer generated. Some more complex ones that don't fall in the algorithm are done manually.
And that's, it's not surprising when you look and you see this over 2 million properties that are assessed. Of course, it would need to be computer driven. And, again, some will be done manually, but most are computer driven. That's another common misconception. People think that it's all manually done.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. There's like 10,000 people doing assessments all by hand using pencils.
Frantically.
Yeah. And the most interesting thing is people get their assessments in the mail and they contact us and they go, well, I just got my assessment, so I know my property is worth. Not necessarily the case, and in fact, most cases, not the case. The day you receive your assessment is not the market value of your home. The day you receive it, it's the market value as of July 1st. Most of us get these in the beginning of the year, following January. So it's about 6 months old.
Yeah, which is substantial in the Vancouver marketplace, or in most markets in BC. It moves pretty quickly, so that will be pretty outdated at that point. So it's really just a snapshot in time, primarily for tax purposes. That's the best way to sum it up.
Absolutely. It's not to let people know how much the property is worth. It's to calculate the taxes in the city or municipality they live in.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, and here, we can talk about how that assessed value has changed year to year in various areas.
Yeah, so since these were from, of course, July of last year, we're recording this in the beginning of 2023. So, this will change year over year, but, depending on sort of what city and area you're in, for example, for single family within the city of Vancouver, saw a 7% increase across the board on average for detached. City of Burnaby was 10%. Some of the higher ones on the list would be New Westminster at 11%. So kind of varies, but again, that's kind of tough to look at because we're talking about now data back from July. So kind of interesting on a year-over-year basis, and this becomes important when you're figuring out, how much has yours gone up versus your neighbor. We'll get into that in a minute for property tax, but we take this with a grain of salt, but kind of interesting. People are always curious to see.
Well, and that's the point. It's not, you can't take that and say, oh, Adam, by the way, my property went up 7%. I just got my assessment. I saw it online. It is from the computer algorithm July 1st of the previous year to July 1st of this past year, it went up 7%.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting to know. Now, the big question we get is, oh, my assessment went up. Will my taxes go up?
Yes.
The most common question. And not necessarily
good answer.
The case.
It depends.
It depends. It might go up. It might not go up, your taxes. It might just stay the same. But it has very little to do with your actual assessment changing, but it has everything to do with the budget that the city sets it at, how your property has fared versus other properties in BC. There's a lot of factors, but let's dive into that.
Yeah. So as Marty pointed out, it depends on the relative change versus the community around. So again, let's look at that example where you say you have a bungalow, you've done an extensive renovation to it, you've added a level. So naturally, that will be reported to BC Assessment, and they're going to know that there is a substantial upgrade done to that home.
Yeah.
So your assessment is going to go up by a greater percentage than your neighbor that has the unrenovated bungalow. So good chance in that case, we can look at some examples, but that would be the simplest example. Good chance in that case your property tax will go up.
Absolutely, because your value changed more than the other properties around you because of that renovation. Fair amount. So let's talk about how this assessment is actually used, the reason we're getting the BC assessment. And it's for, let's take the City of Vancouver, for example. The City of Vancouver wants to calculate how much taxes you owe for the property that you own. Okay, and what they do is they'll take your BC assessment value, they will multiply it by a factor called the mill rate. And has nothing to do with lumber mills or anything like that. They just call it the mill rate, and that's a factor that's calculated. Those two multiplied together will give you your property taxes. Now, people say, well, how do they calculate the mill rate? It's really simple. The City of Vancouver will come up with a budget for the entire year. And they will take that budget and they will divide it by the BC assessment total property values for all the properties in Vancouver proper within the city limit. And the factor of their budget divided by the total property values gives you a ratio or a factor called the mill rate. Now you take that mill rate, it's usually 0.00 something something something, multiplied by your BC assessment gives the city your share of that tax base that they're collecting to fulfill their budget. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just a ratio that they're using to calculate it. And so your assessed value multiplied by the mill rate gives you your property taxes.
For sure.
Okay? Very simple. And will your property taxes change? Well, that will depend on whether or not your BC assessment value for your property is lower than the average change that took place, and in which case your taxes might decrease.
Yes.
Right? Your neighborhood values have dropped, or your property hasn't had any improvements and all your neighbors have, whatever it is. If you're lower than the average, your taxes might reduce. If you are higher than the average, like the example you said, big renovation, your taxes are likely to go up. If you're about the same as the average change, then they're not going to change.
And that's why when you get that's a great example, and that's why when you get your BC assessment notice, it does show what your increase was versus the average, because then you can pretty clearly see that on there, and that will educate you quite quickly on where you stand.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So another great resources to go to get more information besides what you're getting mailed to you is go to the BC Assessment Authority website, www.bcassessment.ca, and there's all sorts of information on there.
Yeah.
There's comparable sales, there's similar property assessments that you can look at. And if you are not happy with your assessed value, you can appeal it.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
And BC Assessment encourages you to give them a call and discuss it. They may be able to provide you some more data. But the important thing to keep in mind is if you do want to appeal it, the deadline is January 31st. So you get that notice, towards the beginning of the year, and you've got about a month, maybe give or take, usually a bit less, to appeal that if you don't feel that it's fair after your research. So that's the sort of timeline that you're working with, and then it all happens again next year.
Yeah, and fair enough. And they've done a really good job in providing a lot of information on the website. So it's really a good place to go for information. So, for example, this past year, we can see where when we discuss assessed values throughout the province, we can isolate certain areas and find out where the assessments went up the most. And I think Carameus went up 20%,
yeah.
Duncan 20%, Port McNeill 23%, Lake Cowichan 23%, Sparwood. Now, I've never been to Sparwood. Have you?
Well, if you blink, you'll miss it. It's a very small town as you shoot.
Can I ask you where Sparwood is?
West Kootenay, I guess you'd call it.
Excellent.
On the Crow's Nest, yeah.
Sparwood. Yeah. Okay, great. I'll try and go there one day. But big jump there for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah.
And that concludes our discussion today, our fireside chat. I want to have that I want to put the fireplace up in the screen so it's burning.
It's a podcast, so you couldn't hear it. Or you could have a crackle in the background.
Well, that's what I mean, a crackle. I want to have a crackle going on.
People are going to think it's their headphones.
Really? Yeah, it's true, actually. Why am I getting so much static listening to these guys? So maybe we won't put the crackling in the background. That's Understanding Your BC Assessment. I'm Marty Pospischil.
I'm Adam Pospischil. Thanks for joining us. Have a great year.
Take care.